The rope was already around her throat when Nathan Hawkins waded into the crowd with nothing but a gutting knife and a fisherman's stubbornness. "Cut her down," he said, and his voice cracked on the second word, because there were 11 of Magistrate Vane's soldiers standing between him and the hanging tree at Ashford Crossing, and he was one man who smelled of river mud and herring scales. Ugek Ironhide did not struggle against the rope. She knelt in the mud with her wrists bound in iron, her green-gray skin streaked with dried blood from a beating she had refused to cry out from, and she looked at the scrawny human wading toward her with something between contempt and disbelief. "Go home, little fish," she said. Her voice was low, rough as river stone, and utterly calm, as though she were not 2 breaths from a hanging. "I do not need saving by a man who smells of bait. Wasn't asking your permission." Nathan kept walking. The soldiers wore the gray and gold of Magistrate Cormac Vane, tax collector for the crown across 3 river valleys, and their sergeant, a broad man named Drask with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, lowered his spear to bar the way. "This is crown business, fisherman," Drask said. "The orc owes back tribute, 2 years unpaid. Turn around before you owe it too. She's paid every season she's been able. I've seen her hand over half her forge earnings at the toll post myself." Nathan's eyes flicked to Ugek, then back to the sergeant. His hands were shaking, but he did not lower them. "You're hanging her for being 3 coppers short because the magistrate raised the levy again last month without telling anyone. The law is the law. Then the law can wait until I've said something, because I'm not asking twice." Nathan reached the base of the hanging tree before anyone thought to stop him, and in the space of one held breath, he cut the rope where it looped over the branch. Ugek Ironhide did not fall. She had already gathered her legs beneath her, and the moment the rope slackened she rose like something uncoiling, 7 feet of orc warrior with the noose still hanging loose from her neck, iron shackles still binding her wrists, and eyes the color of storm-lit amber fixed on the ring of soldiers now backing away from her. Drask lifted his spear. Ugek did not move toward him. She moved toward Nathan instead, close enough that he had to tip his head back to meet her gaze, close enough that he could see the old scars along her jaw and the fresh bruise blooming under one eye. "Why?" she said, not as a threat, but as a genuine question, the kind that seemed to cost her something to ask. "You are nothing to me, you owe me nothing." "Didn't do it because I owed you anything." Nathan swallowed. Behind Ugek, Drask was shouting for the soldiers to reform, to take them both, and villagers were beginning to spill out of the mill and the tavern to see what the noise was. Did it because it was wrong what they were doing. That's all. Man doesn't need a reason beyond that. Ugek studied him a long moment, and something in her face, something guarded and ancient and tired, cracked open just slightly. "Men make vows all the time, fisherman. I have watched kings swear peace on holy blades with their other hand already reaching for the knife. I watched a lord swear safe passage to my chieftains at a feast of reconciliation, and then watched his men close the doors and put them all to the sword while the wine was still being poured. No vow outlasts a war, not one. I stopped believing in them the night I buried my shield sisters in a field my own people had been promised as sanctuary. I haven't made you any vow yet." Nathan held up the knife, empty of malice, just a tool in a trembling hand. "But I'm making one now if you'll hear it. I'll stand at your side for as long as I've got breath in me, war or peace, whether you want me there or not, whether it costs me my boat, my house, or my neck. That's not a promise I intend to break, and I don't care if that sounds like foolishness coming from a man who smells like bait. You can test it every day for the rest of your life. I don't think it'll break." For a moment nobody moved. The soldiers, uncertain, waited on Drask. The villagers, uncertain, waited on nobody. And Ugek Ironhide, who had buried every soft thing in her 15 years of war, looked down at the strange, thin, salt-cracked man who had just cut her free of a hanging tree and offered her a vow like it was the easiest thing in the world. "Test it," she repeated softly, as though tasting the words. "I intend to." Sergeant Drask, sensing the crowd swelling and the mood turning, made the wise choice and ordered his men to fall back, muttering that the magistrate would hear of this. Nathan barely noticed them go. He was still looking up at Ugek Ironhide, at the noose mark reddening on her throat, at the amber eyes that had not looked away from him once, and he understood, with the sudden clarity of a man who has just done something he cannot take back, that his life had changed forever at the base of a hanging tree. It had not begun there, though. That had only been the moment it became undeniable. A year and a half earlier, Nathan Hawkins had arrived at Ashford Crossing with a boat, a net, and almost nothing else, having watched his coastal village burned half to cinders during a levee riot when the Crown's tax collectors decided the fishing quotas hadn't kept pace with the war debt. He had walked inland along the Greywater River until he found a valley of mills and barley fields and orchards that seemed, for the moment, untouched by the worst of it, and a ferryman's crossing where a man could rent a strip of bank and start again with hooks and patience. Millhaven Vale had its own troubles. Even then, 5 years after the long war between the Crown and the Orc clans had sputtered into an uneasy, resentful truce. Farms went half-taxed and half-starved. Old wounds from the war sat close under the surface of every conversation. And at the northern edge of the valley, where the tree line gave way to broken hills, a handful of orcs who had refused to retreat fully with their scattered clans eked out livings as smiths, trappers, and laborers, tolerated only so long as they kept their heads down and their coin purses open to whatever tax was demanded of them that season. Ugek Ironhide had come to the valley not long before Nathan, though neither of them knew it at the time. She had been a war captain once, leader of a shield company in the Ironhide clan's warband, until the Peace of Redok, where old Lord Aldrich Vane had invited 3 orc chieftains and their honor guards to a feast of reconciliation, and then had every one of them killed before the second course was served. Ugek had survived only because she had been posted outside with the horses. She had carried the news back to a clan that no longer had a leadership to receive it, and in the chaos that followed, the Ironhide clan had scattered to the winds, its name become a rumor, its people become wanderers. She did not speak of this often. She did not speak of much at all in those early days to anyone. Nathan first truly spoke to her on a gray morning, when his nets had come up empty for the 4th day running and half. The tavern's patrons were laughing about it behind their tankards, calling him the fisherman who couldn't catch a cold. He had been sitting on the dock mending a torn net when a shadow fell over him, and he looked up to find an orc woman standing there in fitted leather, sleeves cut short to bare forearms corded with muscle, a wide belt cinched at a narrow waist, her dark hair bound back in a tight braid threaded with small iron rings. She was, he thought with the sort of plain honesty a man allows himself only in his own head, the most striking person he had ever seen, dangerous and graceful at once, like a drawn blade left out in the sun. "You are the one they laugh at," she said, not cruelly, simply an observation. "That's me, Nathan Hawkins." He held out a hand out of old habit, then remembered himself and drew it back, uncertain whether an orc would want a human's hand offered to her. Didn't mean to presume. She looked at the offered hand's absence with something like amusement. "You presumed correctly the first time. I do not bite unless provoked." She crouched at the water's edge, studying the current with an expert eye that surprised him. "You are fishing the shallow bend. The fish moved to deeper water 3 days ago when the mill upstream opened its sluice. Try below the second bridge piling near dusk." He tried it. The nets came up so full he had to make 2 trips to carry the catch home, and the next morning he brought a portion of it wrapped in oilcloth to the smithy at the northern edge of the village, where he'd heard the orc woman work the forge for old Bram the smith when he was too drunk to stand at it himself. "Payment," Nathan said, setting the parcel on her work table, "for advice I didn't pay for." Ugek Ironhide looked at the fish, then at him, for a long moment. "Most in this valley would not share bread with me, let alone their catch." "Most in this valley are fools, then." He shrugged, awkward under her stare. I've been the outsider before, don't much care for how it feels. Didn't seem right to hand it out to somebody else. That was the beginning of it, though neither called it that at the time. It began as trade fish for advice, advice for company, company for something neither of them had a name for yet. And it was Ugek, not Nathan, who turned it into a game, because she had spent 5 years watching humans smile at her and mean nothing by it, and she wanted, more than she would admit, to know what this particular human was actually made of. "I dare you," she said to him one evening, not long after, as they sat on the riverbank while he cleaned the day's catch, "to walk into the Ashford Tavern and sit at my table, openly, where Bram and his regulars can see. That a dare or a threat? Both, perhaps." Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. "Let us see which of you breaks first, the fisherman or the village's good opinion of him." He did it that very night, carrying his plate over to the corner table where she sat alone, ignoring the way the tavern went quiet, ignoring Bram's disapproving frown, ignoring the low mutter of a farmer 2 tables over who said something about orclovers loud enough to be heard. Nathan sat, ate, and talked with Ugek about nothing important, the price of rope, the coming harvest, the way the mill wheel groaned on cold mornings, until the tavern remembered how to make noise again. And by the time he left, the mutter had died down to nothing, because there is only so long a room can stay tense over a man eating his supper. "You did not break," Ugek observed afterward, walking him partway back toward the dock in the dark. "Didn't expect to. Told you I wasn't the sort. You told me many things at the hanging tree, fisherman." Wait, that had not happened yet, not for another year, but even before it she had begun, in her own way, to weigh him, testing the small vow implicit in every kindness he offered, waiting for the day it would cost him something real and watching to see if he flinched. He never did. That was perhaps the most unsettling thing about him, from her point of view. Humans flinched. Humans smiled warmly and then found convenient reasons to be elsewhere when the cost of kindness rose. Nathan Hawkins simply kept showing up, kept bringing fish, kept sitting at her table, kept walking her partway home in the dark as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And slowly, without ever quite deciding to, Ugek Ironhide found herself waiting for the sound of his boots on the dock each evening the way she had once waited for the horn calls of her shield sisters. It was around this time that Magistrate Cormac Vane, son of the very Lord Aldrich Vane who had ordered the slaughter at Ridoke, having inherited both his father's title, and it seemed, his father's appetite for cruelty dressed as governance, arrived to take up the crown's tax seat over 3 river valleys, Millhaven among them. Vane was not a soldier by temperament, though he kept a company of hard mercenary men, the Grey Wardens, quartered at the old keep above the valley. He was a tallier of coin, narrow-faced, soft-handed. With an easy smile he used the way other men used knives, and within a season of his arrival, the levies on Millhaven Vale had climbed twice, the toll at Ashford Crossing had tripled, and a new tax specifically for war reparations owed by remaining hostile parties residing in Crown lands had been imposed on every orc still living within the valley's borders, Ugek Ironhide among them. "He means to starve us out," Ugek told Nathan one evening, sharpening a blade with slow, even strokes at her forge, "or hang enough of us that the rest flee on their own. Either serves him. An empty valley pays no argument, only rent to whoever he sells the land to next. Then we don't let him." Nathan said it simply, as though the answer were obvious, and Ugek looked at him with an expression he was coming to recognize equal parts exasperation and something warmer she had not yet let herself name. "We," she repeated. "You keep saying that word as though it includes you in matters that could see you hanged beside me. It does include me. Seems it has for a while now." It was not long after that the river flooded early, swollen with spring melt from the high passes, and the ferry that normally carried folk and goods across the Greywater was deemed too dangerous to run. Half the valley's harvest sat stranded on the wrong bank, needed at the mill before it spoiled, and old Pell the ferryman refused to risk his boat or his neck in the current. "I could swim it," Nathan said, standing on the bank looking at the brown, churning water with the particular grim calculation of a man who has drowned in his imagination more than once, towing a line across. Somebody's got to. You would drown before you reached the second sandbar. Ugek's voice was flat, final. I dare you not to try it. That an order. It is a dare, and I am telling you plainly this once that I want you to lose it. For once there was no teasing in her tone. She stepped past him to the water's edge, stripped off her boots, and before he could argue further, she had waded in, the current dragging hard against her legs, and called back over her shoulder. Climb on, fisherman, if you insist on being useful. I will not have you dead of stubbornness before you have paid off the debt of that vow you made me. He hesitated only a moment before he did as she said, one arm hooked around her shoulders while she cut through the flood water with powerful, even strokes. The whole village turned out along both banks to watch, some cheering, some scandalized, a knot of Vane's gray wardens watching from the keep road with expressions that promised trouble later. She delivered him and the tow line to the far bank without so much as a stumble, and when he slid off her back into the mud, breathless and soaked and laughing despite himself, she looked down at him with amber eyes bright with something dangerously close to affection. You are the worst dare I have ever won, she told him. You didn't win. I let you carry me. You let me. She snorted, offering a hand to pull him upright, and did not let go of it immediately once he was standing. Careful, fisherman. A man who lets an orc carry him across a flooded river in front of the whole valley is a man inviting rumor. Let them talk. His hand was still in hers. Neither of them moved to change that. I stopped caring what this valley whispers about me a while back. That was the summer the whispers turned, slowly, from scandal to something almost like acceptance, though not everyone in Millhaven Vale was so generous. Magistrate Vane's gray wardens took to patrolling the market square with a heavier hand as the season wore on, and one autumn afternoon, as Ugek stood at a stall buying nails for repair work, Sergeant Drask and 3 of his men cornered her against the wall with the casual cruelty of men who knew the law would never question them. Orc tax is due again, Drask said, close enough that his breath fogged in the cold air near her face. Magistrate says if the ironhide bitch can't pay, she can work it off some other way. I'm sure we can find a use for you. The market went silent around them, the way markets do when something ugly is about to happen, and everyone is deciding whether to watch or look away. Ugek's hand had already dropped to the hammer at her belt, and she could have ended the confrontation in 3 seconds with violence that would have gotten her hanged by nightfall, treaty or no treaty, and some dark, tired part of her almost welcomed the excuse. It was Nathan who stepped between them, having crossed the square at a dead run the moment he'd seen the soldiers circle her, his boots skidding in the mud, no weapon in his hands but the sheer stubborn fact of his body placed directly in Drask's path. Touch her and you'll answer to more than the magistrate, he said, and his voice, though not loud, carried across the frozen market square. There's a dozen farmers here who'll tell the Crown Circuit exactly what you tried, and I'll be the first witness standing in line. Move, fisherman, before I put you in the mud. Try it. Nathan did not move. His heart was hammering so hard he thought Drask must be able to hear it, but he held his ground, and behind him, close enough that he could feel the heat of her, Ugek Ironhide's hand tightened on her hammer, not to strike, but simply because watching this thin, ordinary man plant himself between her and 4 armed soldiers had done something to the careful walls she had built around her heart, something that felt dangerously like it was cracking open for good. The standoff broke only when old Bram the smith, of all people, stepped out from the crowd with a heavy fuller's hammer of his own and planted himself at Nathan's shoulder, and then a farmer named Willem did the same, and within a minute a dozen villagers had formed a loose, silent wall around the 2 of them, ordinary folk with nothing but work tools and their own bodies, and Sergeant Drask, doing the arithmetic of a man who did not want to explain a market riot to his magistrate, spat in the mud and withdrew with his men. That night Ugek found Nathan alone on the dock, mending nets by lantern light out of habit more than need, and she sat beside him without asking, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You could have died today," she said. "So could you. I am built for that, you are not." She turned to look at him, and in the lantern light her face was unguarded in a way he had never seen it. "Why do you keep doing this, fisherman? Every dare I set meant half the time to send you running, you meet, and worse. Today was no dare. Today you simply walked into a spear's reach for me without being asked." Nathan set down his net. "Because I meant what I said at the hanging tree. I don't make vows I don't intend to keep, Ugek. Never have. My father used to say a man's word is the only coin he can't counterfeit, and I believed him." He hesitated, and then, because the lantern light and the closeness of her and 18 months of careful, aching patience had worn away whatever reserve he had left, he said the rest of it plainly. "And because I love you. Have for longer than I've had the nerve to say it. Don't need you to say it back. Just needed you to know it's why." Ugek Ironhide, who had faced down cavalry charges and siege lines, and the death of everyone she had ever sworn shield oaths beside, found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely without words. She reached out instead slowly and laid her palm against the side of his face, her thumb tracing the salt-weathered lines at the corner of his eye, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost every trace of its usual iron. "I have tested you for 1.5 years, Nathan Hawkins, because I did not believe a vow could survive what this world does to soft things. I am still not certain it can." She leaned closer, close enough that he could feel her breath. "But I find that I want, very badly, to be wrong about that. Test that against me if you like. I dare you." He closed the distance instead of answering, and the kiss that followed was neither soft nor careful. It was the kiss of 1.5 years of held breath finally released, of two people who had circled each other through dares and dangers and near hangings, finally admitting there was nowhere left to circle to. When they finally broke apart, both of them a little stunned, Ugek laughed, low and real, a sound he had never once heard from her before. "That," she said, "is the first dare I have ever regretted losing." "You didn't lose, I just answered honestly." Keep answering honestly, fisherman, and see how far it gets you. It got him, over the following weeks, considerably further. Word spread through Millhaven Vale of the fisherman and the orc smith who had faced down the Grey Wardens together. And the gossip took on a different character than before, less scandal, more grudging, curious respect. Though there remained those in the valley who crossed themselves or spat when Ugek passed, and Nathan learned to simply stand closer to her when they did, a silent answer that needed no words. At the harvest festival that autumn, held in the mill yard with lanterns strung between the beams and cider flowing free, Ugek dared him again, this time in front of half the valley, her eyes bright with cider and daring and something warmer besides. "I dare you to kiss me here," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "in front of every farmer and miller's wife who ever whispered about the fisherman and his orc. Let them see plainly what they have been whispering about." Nathan Hawkins did not hesitate. He kissed her in the lantern light of the mill yard, in front of Bram and Willem and old Pell the ferryman and Mother Yeva who kept the village's records and half the farming families of the valley. And when he drew back, there was a beat of silence. And then, astonishingly, someone began to clap. And then someone else, until the mill yard rang with it, not universal, not without a few sour faces turning away, but enough that Ugek Ironhide, who had buried 3 shield sisters under a false peace and sworn never again to trust anything soft, stood in the lantern light with tears she refused to acknowledge standing in her amber eyes, and let the valley see her claimed. It was not long after the festival that she gave him the mark that sealed it in the way her people understood such things, not a ceremony with witnesses, but a quiet, private thing done at her forge one night, where she drew a thin line of blood from her own palm with a blade heated in the coals, then did the same to his, and pressed the two together until the wounds mingled and closed. "Among my people," she told him, her voice low and steady in the firelight, "this is a claiming. It means I have chosen you before my ancestors and my dead shield sisters, and there is no unchoosing it after. It is not lightly done. I have never done it before, not for anyone. Then I'm glad it's me." He held her hand a long moment, watching the thin scar already beginning to knit. "Feels a lot like the vow I made you at the hanging tree, if I'm honest. Different words, same meaning. Perhaps." Ugak drew him closer, and in the banked heat of the forge fire, in the small stone room that smelled of iron and smoke, what had been building between them for 2 years finally found its full expression. Unhurried despite the years of waiting, tender despite the calluses on both their hands, a warmth traded slow and deep between a fisherman who had nothing to offer but honesty and a warrior who had nothing left to lose but her guarded heart, until there was no careful distance left between them at all. Only the two of them, entwined, murmuring vows that needed no witnesses because they had already been sworn once, at a hanging tree, in front of soldiers who had meant to kill her. The valley settled into something like peace after that, not an easy peace, not with Vane's levies still climbing and his gray wardens still patrolling with their casual cruelty, but a peace between Ugek and Nathan that neither dare nor doubt could touch. She kept testing him still, because it had become as much a habit of affection as suspicion by then, daring him to race her along the riverbank, daring him to spar with her at the forge yard and see how long he lasted against her. Never long, but he always tried, and she always laughed, delighted when he ended up flat on his back in the dirt, daring him to name, in front of Bram's whole tavern, exactly what he loved about an orc smith who could bend iron barehanded. He answered everyone. She kept score, she told him once, only half joking, of every dare he had ever won, and the number by the 3rd year had climbed higher than she had ever expected any humans could. It was in the spring of that 3rd year that Magistrate Cormac Vane decided the valley had grown too comfortable, too united, too willing to stand shoulder to shoulder between him and the coin he meant to extract from it, and resolved to end that comfort permanently. The trouble began with a letter, nailed to the door of the Ashford Tavern by one of the gray wardens on a cold morning in early spring. A proclamation, in Vane's ornate hand, declaring that given the seditious harboring of hostile war parties within Crown lands, Millhaven Vale's tax burden would triple again, effective immediately, and that the orc smith Ugek Ironhide, known agitator and unlawful resident, was to present herself at the keep within 3 days to answer for crimes against the Crown's peace, or the whole valley would be held liable in her place. "He means to make you a hostage for the valley's obedience," Nathan said, reading the notice a second time as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less dire, "or an excuse to burn the whole vale down around us if you refuse." Both, likely. Ugek's face had gone very still, the stillness of a war captain doing calculations she had not needed to do in years. He is his father's son. Aldrich Vane did not build his peace on mercy either. He built it on making an example no one would forget. "Then we don't give him you." Nathan crumpled the notice in his fist. "There has to be another way. There may not be, fisherman." Her voice was gentle, but final in a way that frightened him more than anger would have. "I will not let this valley burn for my sake. Not after what I watched a false peace cost my own people. I would rather walk into that keep myself than let Vane use me as the reason to destroy everything you and I have spent 3 years building." This, in the end, was the dare that mattered most, though she never called it that, the test that had nothing to do with courage or trust or love, and everything to do with whether the vow Nathan had made at the hanging tree could survive not a soldier's spear, but her own willingness to sacrifice herself for the people who had only grudgingly accepted her. "No," Nathan said, and there was iron in his voice she had rarely heard, the iron of a man who has finally found the one thing he will not bend on. "I didn't cut you down from a hanging tree 3 years ago to hand you over to the same kind of man who put the rope there in the first place. You want to test whether my vow means anything, Ugek. Here it is, tested to the bone." I am not letting you walk into that keep alone, and I am not letting you walk into it at all if I can find any way to stop it. We fight this together, or we run together, but we are not doing this apart. That's the vow. That's always been the vow." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest, some final wall she had kept standing even through the claiming and the years of testing, finally gave way entirely. "Then we fight," she said. "But you should know, fisherman, if we fight, it will not be a fair fight. Vane has 40 gray wardens quartered at that keep, trained men, and we have farmers with pitchforks and a smith with one good hammer arm. Then we'd better make the ground unfair instead." Word went out through Millhaven Vale within the day, carried by Bram, by Willem, by Mother Yeva, by the handful of other orcs still living at the valley's edge who had watched Ugek Ironhide face down soldiers and hangings for 3 years without ever once asking anything of them in return, and who now, for the first time, were asked. Not everyone answered. Some families packed wagons and fled south rather than risk Vane's wrath. But more stayed than Nathan had dared to hope, and by the third morning, when the gray wardens marched down from the keep road with Magistrate Vane himself riding at their rear in a fine cloak that had never once seen a battlefield, they found Ashford Crossing waiting for them, and it was not empty. The bridge across the Greywater at Ashford Crossing was old, timber-built, wide enough for 2 wagons abreast, and it was the only crossing for miles in either direction, the river running high and fast on both sides from the spring melt. Nathan had spent 3 days and 3 sleepless nights working with Willem and Old Pell to weaken the central span's key timbers just enough that a hard blow in the right place would drop it, while leaving it stable enough to bear ordinary traffic until then. Ugek had spent those same days at the forge, working alongside Bram to turn every scythe and plow blade and fence post the valley could spare into something sharper, and organizing the farmers into rough lines behind whatever cover the riverbank offered. When Vane's 40 gray wardens reached the crossing, they found it blocked by a wall of overturned wagons, and behind that wall, some 60 villagers with farm tools and hunting bows, and at the center of the line, standing shoulder to shoulder in the cold spring wind, Ugek Ironhide in her fitted leathers with a war hammer freshly reforged, and Nathan Hawkins beside her with nothing grander than a boat hook and a coil of rope, both of them entirely unwilling to move. "This is madness," Vane called from horseback, safely behind his line of soldiers, his easy smile stretched thin over something closer to genuine irritation. "You cannot hold a crossing against trained men with pitchforks, fisherman. Step aside, hand over the orc, and I will see the rest of you fined rather than hanged for this idiocy." "You'll get neither the orc nor the crossing," Nathan called back, and his voice, to his own surprise, did not shake. "This valley's paid your taxes and buried your levies for 5 years, and we are done handing you anything else." Vane's smile vanished. He gave the order, and the gray wardens advanced onto the bridge in a tight, disciplined column, shields raised, and for one terrible moment it seemed the villagers' line, brave as it was, would simply be ridden down by professional soldiers with better steel and years of drilling behind them. An impossible fight by any honest accounting. 60 farmers and 1 orc smith against 40 trained mercenaries with the narrow bridge as the only ground to hold. "Now, Pell!" Nathan shouted, and Old Pell the ferryman, stationed at the bridge's near end with a sledgehammer he had not swung in 20 years, brought it down with everything his aging body could muster on the weakened central support. The bridge did not collapse entirely. It groaned, dropped several feet at its center with a shriek of splitting timber, and canted hard to one side, sending the lead rank of gray wardens sprawling and scrambling, several soldiers pitching over the broken edge into the flood-swollen river below, their heavy armor dragging them under before their fellows could reach them. The column's tight discipline shattered into chaos on the tilting, half-broken span, and it was into that chaos that Ugek Ironhide moved, not waiting for orders, because she had been a war captain long before she was anything else, and she knew a broken enemy line when she saw one. She went through the soldiers on the bridge like a scythe through wheat, her war hammer moving with brutal, economical force, never killing where a broken shield arm or a cracked knee would end a man's part in the fight just as surely. Because, for all her fury, she had not forgotten Nathan's insistence, argued fiercely over the planning days before, that they end this with as few deaths as possible if there was any way to manage it. Behind her, the villagers held the near bank with bows and pitchforks, driving back the soldiers who tried to scramble past the broken span, and Nathan, boat hook in hand, found himself locked in a desperate, ugly scramble at the bridge's edge with a gray warden twice his size, saved only by Willem's timely pitchfork jab that sent the man stumbling long enough for Nathan to shove him bodily into the river. It should not have worked. 40 trained soldiers against 60 farmers should have ended in a massacre, and for several minutes it seemed it still might, as Sergeant Drask rallied a knot of soldiers on the far bank and began working his way around the broken bridge through the shallows, aiming to flank the villagers' position entirely. It was Ugek who saw it first, breaking off from the bridge fight and crossing the canted, broken timbers at a dead run, each stride sure despite the wreckage beneath her feet, to meet Drask's flanking party at the water's edge alone. "Ironhide," Drask spat, drawing his sword. "Should have hanged you myself when I had the chance." "You had the chance," Ugek said, planting herself between his 6 soldiers and the villagers' exposed flank, "and you let a fisherman stop you. That is going to be the whole of your legacy, Sergeant, remembered if at all as the man who lost to a fisherman." What followed was the kind of fight that should, by any reasonable measure, have ended with Ugek Ironhide dead on the riverbank. One orc smith against 6 armed soldiers with nothing behind her but cold water and no retreat. The moment the entire desperate stand pivoted on, the impossible odds made suddenly, brutally concrete. She took a sword cut along her forearm, turning aside a strike meant for her throat, blood running hot down to her wrist. And still she did not fall back, because falling back meant the villagers' flank opened, meant Nathan and Willem and Bram and Mother Yeva's whole valley exposed to 6 trained blades, and there was no version of herself, not after 3 years of being chosen and choosing in return, that would let that happen while she still drew breath. It was Nathan who reached her first, sliding down the muddy bank with nothing but the boat hook and a fury he had never known he possessed, driving the hook's point into the gap of a soldier's raised guard hard enough to send the man reeling. And then it was Nathan and Ugek fighting back to back at the river's edge, her hammer and his hook, a fisherman and a war captain making an utterly mismatched, utterly unbreakable pair, until Bram arrived with 3 farmers at his heels and the 6 soldiers. Seeing themselves suddenly outnumbered, and their sergeant bleeding from a hammer blow to the ribs, broke and fled downstream through the shallows. On the bridge, the remaining gray wardens, seeing their flanking maneuver collapse and their central column scattered and half-drowned, began throwing down their weapons rather than continue a fight that had gone from a certainty to a rout in the space of 10 desperate minutes. Magistrate Cormac Vane, who had watched the entire disaster from horseback without ever once drawing closer than the far end of the ruined bridge, wheeled his horse to flee up the keep road alone, and it was Ugek Ironhide, blood-soaked and breathing hard, who caught him, not with violence, but by hurling her war hammer with terrible accuracy into the road ahead of his horse, close enough to spook the animal into throwing him from the saddle into the mud, where he lay stunned long enough for Willem and 2 farmers to pin him down and bind his hands with the same rope that had, 3 years before, been meant for Ugek's neck. The silence that followed the fighting was almost stranger than the battle itself, the ruined bridge groaning in the current, the river running faster with the debris of it, wounded men on both sides being tended by whoever had bandages to spare. And in the middle of it all, Nathan Hawkins pulling Ugek Ironhide into an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked them both into the mud, his hands shaking as he checked the cut along her forearm. Hers cupping his face, as though she could not quite believe he had come through the fight without worse than a split lip. "You are never," she said, her voice rough with something that was not quite anger and not quite tears, "allowed to throw yourself at 6 armed men again, fisherman. I mean that. Neither are you." He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing hard. "We're a matched pair, apparently, both too stubborn to run. We won." She said it slowly, as though testing whether the word could possibly apply to what had just happened. "By every reckoning I know, we should not have 40 trained soldiers, and we had farmers and a bridge." "Had you?" Nathan said simply. "And you had all of us. Guess that was the difference." Word of what happened at Ashford Crossing did not stay contained to Millhaven Vale for long. Within a fortnight, a circuit magistrate from the Crown's own court arrived from the capital, summoned by no less than 3 separate letters. One from Mother Yeva detailing 5 years of illegal levies with a ledger's precision, one from Bram describing the assault on the market square the previous autumn, and one, most damning of all, from a captured Sergeant Drask, who, facing charges of his own, proved considerably more willing to speak the full truth of Magistrate Vane's extortions. Once he understood the alternative was hanging alone for a crime his master had ordered. The trial was held in the mill yard, of all places, the same lantern-strung beams where Nathan had once kissed Ugek in front of the whole valley, now hung instead with the Crown's own banners, brought by the circuit magistrate to lend the proceeding proper weight. Cormac Vane, stripped of his fine cloak and standing in the mud where his soldiers had once made villagers kneel, was found guilty of extortion, of unlawful violence against Crown subjects, and of provoking armed conflict through corrupt governance, and was led away in chains to a fate considerably less merciful than the one he had intended for Ugek Ironhide. It was Ugek herself who was asked, before the crowd dispersed, to speak, an orc, addressing a mill yard full of humans at the invitation of the Crown's own circuit magistrate, an occurrence so unlikely that even Mother Yeva, who had seen a great deal in her long years of keeping the valley's records, admitted she had never expected to witness it. "I was told once," Ugek said, standing on the mill's loading platform where everyone could see her, Nathan close beside her though not required to be, "that no vow outlasts a war. I believed that for a long time because I watched a peace built on promises collapse into a slaughter that took everyone I had sworn my life beside. I came to this valley expecting nothing from it and asking for less. I did not expect to be offered a vow that meant something, from a man with nothing to gain and everything to lose by giving it. I have spent 3 years testing whether it would break." She looked down at Nathan, and whatever remained of the guarded warrior who had knelt at a hanging tree with a rope around her throat was entirely gone from her face, replaced by something open and unashamed. "It has not broken. I do not believe now that it will." The mill yard, which had once gone silent with scandal at the sight of a fisherman sitting at an orc's table, erupted instead into something closer to celebration. Not universal. There were still faces in the crowd that remained cold. Prejudice does not vanish in a single afternoon, no matter how deserved the victory. But enough, more than enough, that when Nathan Hawkins stepped up beside Ugek Ironhide on that platform and took her scarred hand in his without hesitation, in front of the circuit magistrate, in front of Bram and Willem and Mother Yeva and Pell and the whole assembled valley, no one moved to stop them, and no one looked away in shame. "I dare you," Ugek murmured to him, low enough that only he could hear it over the crowd's noise, her thumb tracing the old, thin scar on his palm where their blood had once mingled at her forge, "to marry a war captain who has nothing to offer you but a valley's respect and a temper that will likely outlast us both. Already agreed to worse odds than that, standing at a hanging tree." Nathan lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the scar. "I'll take those odds every time for the rest of my life if you're the one setting them. Careful what you promise, fisherman." But she was smiling now, fully, unguardedly, in a way the valley had never seen from her before and would see often after. "I intend to keep testing you, Every day if I can manage it. Wouldn't have you any other way." The magistrate finished his business that afternoon and rode back toward the capital with Cormac Vane in chains behind him, and Millhaven Vale, freed at last of the levies and the fear that had shadowed it for 5 years, settled into a spring that felt, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, entirely its own. The bridge at Ashford Crossing was rebuilt within the month, sturdier than before, and it became something of a local tradition, whispered among the valley's younger folk for years after, that the central span had once been a fisherman's clever ruin, and that an Orc war captain had crossed its broken timbers at a dead run to save the man who had, 3 years before that, cut her down from a rope with nothing but a gutting knife and a vow he refused to break. Ugek kept her forge at the northern edge of the village, though she no longer worked it alone or unwelcomed farmers who had once crossed themselves at her passing, now brought their plowshares and broken tools to her without a second thought, and more than one young Orc family, hearing that Millhaven Vale had become a place where such a life was possible, made their way down from the hills to settle at its edges in the seasons that followed. Nathan kept his boat and his nets, though he spent as many evenings at Ugak's forge as he did on the water, and the two of them built, timber by timber and season by season, a small stone house within sight of both the crossing and the river, close enough to the water that he could still smell the salt of the sea some mornings when the wind turned right, close enough to the forge that the sound of her hammer against iron became, for him, the sound of home. On the evening the house was finished, they stood together on its threshold, the grey-water running silver in the last of the sunset behind them, and Ugek Ironhide, who had once told a stranger at a hanging tree that no vow outlasted a war, turned to the man who had proven her wrong for the better part of 4 years running. "I have tested you enough now, I think," she said, her voice quiet, certain, stripped entirely of the guarded distance she had once worn like armor. "There is nothing left to test. You have stood between me and a hanging, a mob, a flood, 40 soldiers, and my own worst fears about what I deserve to keep. I do not think there is a dare left in this valley that would tell me anything I do not already know." "And what do you know?" Nathan asked, though he thought he already understood the answer, had understood it for a long while, in every quiet evening and every dare answered and every scar shared between them. "That you meant it," Ugek said simply, "every word at that hanging tree. That some vows do outlast a war, and worse than a war, and I was fortunate enough, against every hard lesson I had learned before you, to be loved by a man who kept his." She kissed him then, in the doorway of the house they had built together, with the river running gold and silver behind them and the whole rebuilt valley settling into evening around them, and there was no dare left in it at all, only the simple, hard-won certainty of two people who had tested each other through fire and flood and impossible odds, and had chosen, every single time, to stay.